I want to thank two of the previous speakers for kind of setting the stage for this class on parenting. As if you heard Ralph Gilmore last night, he said there is no such thing as natural children. And then Bruce this morning said that parenting is very messy. So, thank you, fellas. I think you set the stage well. We're ready to get into this topic. I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. But before I do that, I want you to know who my wife is. Tanya, would you raise your hand, please? This is Tanya. Nearly everything I learned about parenting came from right there. So I'm just kind of being a voice for Tanya. She's been excellent help me in every sense of the term. And I truly and honestly have learned much from her about parenting. And she has helped me to be a better parent. And I'm glad that she's able to be here this morning. And I want to encourage you. Last time I did this kind of thing, there was a young mother in particular that was there that had some very specific questions. And Tanya was not able to be with me on that occasion. And I wish so desperately that the young mother would have had an opportunity to ask her questions of Tanya. So I say that to tell you that if there's some things specifically you want to talk about as a mother, young children, so on, feel free to visit with Tanya. She'd love to visit with you. Tanya, not only mother of our two children, but she has provided daycare in our home for 25 years. And we've had little ones running around our house forever. And what I've noticed over the years is that not only is Tanya training those children, she trains the mothers too. Because at the end of the day, they talk about the day and what the children did. And they say, you got her or him to do that? Really? How did you do that? And so Tanya does a lot of training with the mothers. So I just wanted for you to know that she's here as a resource for that. My vantage point. I'm not an expert in parenting. I wouldn't even begin to pretend to present myself that way. I am a parent with 24 years of experience. I do not know what to do in every situation. Many situations in which, as a parent, I feel that I am at a loss. But my wife and I have been down the road of parenting, and we have experienced things, and I think we have learned along the way. As a young preacher, my first full-time preaching job was in a community near where my dad preached for 27 years. And so I was able to visit with him quite often. And I went by his office one day, but I had to wait to speak with him because he was talking to some parents of a teenage daughter who had just learned crushing news. And when they left and I sat down with Dad, he was visibly, emotionally moved by the pain of those parents. And my dad's not just a real emotional kind of a guy. More so now, but not then. He said, David, I want to tell you something that an old preacher told me when I first started preaching. Especially when you're dealing with the troubles and the struggles and the trials that people face in their lives. He said, that old preacher said to me, remember that there, but by the grace of God, goes you or I. And you've probably heard that before in some form or another. Parenting is a great challenge. It is a tremendous challenge. 11 months ago, March the 31st, 2008, a young mother by the name of Heather, who lived in a rural area north of Tahlequah in Cherokee County, felt like she must escape the rising floodwaters of Clear Creek that flowed near her home and get away. She made the decision not to drive the car across the low water bridge. And so she took her 2-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, and placed her on her shoulders and began to try to wade across the creek. And in a very short time, Heather realized that she made a very serious error in judgment. The current was much swifter than she had judged. And the footing was much more unstable than she anticipated. And before she knew it, the waters had swept her off of her feet and swept her daughter out of her grasp. And she watched helplessly as little Mackenzie was carried downstream. And it was not until the next day that the limp and lifeless body of Mackenzie was recovered from a pile of brush along the creek. As Christian parents, we are treading very treacherous waters. And in our care are the lives and, more importantly, the souls of our children. And the current is strong. And the footing is unstable. And their lives and their souls are being threatened to be swept away from us by a wicked and godless world. But we are not without recourse. We are not without recourse. As the prophet Elijah responded to the concerns of his servant who looked out and saw a very imposing and threatening army, Elisha said to that man, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And then he prayed, "O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the servant, and he saw, and behold, the mountains were full of horses and chariots of fire all around. And my prayer is that the Lord will open the eyes of Christian parents, that they may see. That they may see, first of all, that they have been given by God a responsibility and a role as the primary teachers and guides of their children. Not somebody else. Not anybody else. But they are the primary guide and teacher of those children. And secondly, that their eyes may be open to the fact that He has provided resources of which we can avail ourselves, that we can successfully traverse the very dangerous and threatening waters that are this world. Now, our plan for these two classes are this. We're going to begin with this hour with primarily a textual study. And then in the second session, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some very practical things, practical pointers or ideas. Now, I say that's our plan. It's going to get kind of jumbled up as we go along these two sessions as well. So I want you to turn with me, if you have your Bibles, to the book of 1 Chronicles. Now, if we were to have taken a little survey, we've got a handout here we're going to pass out. It's just a fill-in-the-blank little outline for both sessions, front and back. Use that if you like to. Please don't make paper airplanes out of it and do that kind of thing with it. But it might help you as we go through this. Now, if we had taken a little poll at the beginning of this class just to guess, okay, what book of the Bible might we be turning to study about parenting this morning? I have a feeling that 1 Chronicles would not have ranked very high on the list of possibilities here. But that's where we're going this morning, because in it is recorded an incident from the life of David that I think wonderfully illustrates the challenge and the task that is before us as parents. And I want to use that as the basis for our study in this first session this morning. 1 Chronicles chapter 22. And I want us to start our reading with verse 5. And David said, "My son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord shall be exceedingly magnificent, famous and glorious throughout all lands. Therefore I will make preparation for it." So David made ample preparations before his death. Now, I didn't save one of those handouts with me, so I don't remember what the blanks are exactly. Folks at Tahlequah, they accuse me of being OCD. If I don't specifically state what is exactly on the outline so the fill in the blank is absolutely obvious, I get in more trouble than for anything else I do. David, number one, made preparations. David made preparations. Now, what we're talking about here in 1 Chronicles 22 is preparations for the construction of the temple. And the construction of the temple was a very significant event of Old Testament history. Because what was to transpire was going to transpire according to the Lord's will. I want you to notice beginning in verse 7 here in chapter 22. And David said to Solomon, "My son, I had intended to build a house to the name of the Lord my God, but the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth before me. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side, for his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name, and he shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever." The construction of this house by the son of David, Solomon, was according to the will of God. That was what God wanted to happen. A little bit later, in chapter 28 and verse 19, David said all this referring to the temple and its plans and the preparations we're going to talk about here. All this, David said, "The Lord made me understand in writing by His hand upon me all the details of this pattern." David wasn't just out here doing what he judged to be the best thing to do. He was doing what God had directed him to do. Now I want you to consider with me for just a moment the extent to which David went to prepare. First of all, if you'll read the first verses of chapter 22, you will find David gathering together all of the necessary materials for construction. I think Ralph would be upset if we didn't have any real carpenters at work on the construction of the temple. I don't know. They talk about here about cutting the stones by the stone cutters. Cut all the stones in preparation for the construction. Verse 3, prepared large quantities of iron to make the nails for the doors and the gates and for the clamps, and made bronze and more bronze than could be weighed, and timbers of cedar logs beyond number. He gathered all of the materials that were needed for the construction. You go on into chapter 23, and David makes arrangements for all of the Levites who are going to serve. Chapter 24, the priests who are going to serve. Chapter 25, the musicians, not magicians, the musicians that are going to serve. And chapter 26, the gatekeepers and the treasurers. And as we've already noted in verse 19 of 28, the plan and the pattern for the temple was all written down, and it was according to the Lord's will and what He had instructed in chapter 29. He raised the finances. David made preparation. And he made preparation in view of the magnitude of what needed to be done, in view of the youth and inexperience of his son, Solomon, and in view of the plan of God. Think about the magnitude of what David did. And remember that you and I, as parents, have a task ahead of us that is far greater in significance than the task that David had ahead of him. David was making preparation for the temple of God. But so are we, aren't we? We're told in the New Testament that the temple of God is, 1 Corinthians, it's the church, but it is also each individual Christian. And it is the intent of God that we become His temple, His dwelling place. And you think about what we're doing as parents and what's presented to us as parents as God blesses us with those children. As such, we are given the care of one of God's creation, one that has been made in His image. And we are to provide for, and we are to nurture, and we are to rear those children. But the time is going to come in which we are going to relinquish the control. We're going to relinquish the authority. We're going to, as it were, set that child loose into the world. That's a scary thing to think about. It's a scary thing to experience. Is that child ready? Is the child ready? I think my son is already getting sick and tired of me. He's going to be leaving this fall to go to college. And I can just hear the clock. It's ticking off. My time is short. Is Dalton ready to leave home? And so every time it's just Dalton and I. Son, I want to talk to you about something. And I don't have to see it. Boy, the eyes just roll back in his head. We have a great task. Is this child ready to be able to go out into the world and earn a living? Is this child going to be prepared to be married? Is this child going to be prepared to be a parent? Is this a child going to be prepared to engage in social activity and to be able to function appropriately in relationship to other people in a community? Is this child going to be able to be a temple of God? Is this child going to be one who desires God's Spirit to dwell in him and in whom God is pleased to dwell? Are you recognizing the magnitude of the responsibility and the job that we have as teachers, as parents? And David wasn't doing nothing. You and I are making ready people, our children, to be the temple of God. David understood the importance of the preparation that had to be undergone for this to take place. He wasn't going to be the one who built the temple, but he had to make sure that it was very possible. He had to remove every possible obstacle that he could so that his son could build the temple. And as parents, we cannot assume that our children are going to grow up to be God's temple. Proverbs 22:6 is not a guarantee. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. It's a proverb. It's not a guarantee. And so it demands upon our part as parents preparation. Because what is going to happen in regard to our children is going to happen by and large because of the preparations that we have made. You cannot make your child to be God's temple. But what you can do is to make preparations in such a way that everything is in place and enough obstacles are removed that becomes a very natural thing to happen. Was Solomon not going to build the temple? We make preparations. But not only did David make preparations. Number 2, David had a plan. And his plan was for preparing that which was to be exceedingly magnificent, famous, and glorious. And when you're dealing with something like that, you are not going to go about this in a half-hearted fashion. There are no shortcuts. There will be no negligence and no oversight in the process. There can never be in the mind of the parent the attitude or the thought that says, well, the rearing and the training of my child is important and I'm going to do that someday. If that thought enters your mind, you're planning for failure. Because this is that important, I will address it now. I will not wait another day. It must happen now. We know that God has a plan for His people. And His plan is that His people be a holy people. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 15. His plan is that His people be ones of surpassing or exceeding righteousness. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. His plan is that His people be conformed to the image of His Son. Romans chapter 8 and verse 29. And guess whom God has in mind to get children to be able to become that? It's parents. It is parents. David had in mind for his son Solomon a very specific path that he wanted him to follow. In chapter 28 and verse 9, David spoke these words to Solomon. As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve Him with a whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek Him, He will let you find Him. But if you forsake Him, He will reject you forever. There was a path that he intended for his son to follow in relationship with God. What path will our children follow? Chances are, in all likelihood, they're going to follow the path that we set them on. From that standpoint, this is not rocket. There's a book. Parenting is not rocket science. This is not rocket science. They're going to follow the path that we set them on. One of my very best friends also happens to be our youth minister, youth and family minister at Tahlequah. I know that there are not a lot of preachers who have the opportunity to make that kind of a statement, and I'm glad to be able to make that statement. Terrell Hatfield. He and his wife Lisa are here. They've got the table out here with Little Acorn out before you want to go look at some of their materials, which we will talk about here just a little bit later. Terrell and I talk a lot. We are one another's confidants when we experience frustrations. If you didn't know this, ministers sometimes get frustrated. It happens. Right, Louis? It happens. Just this past week, Terrell was sharing some of his frustrations with me in regard to parents. Parents who are concerned for the well-being, the spiritual well-being of their children, their teenage children. And these parents, they know what the church ought to be doing. They know what the youth minister ought to be doing. But what they don't realize is that their children are following the precise path that they as parents have set them on. It's not a mystery. It is not a mystery. You have watched these parents with their children when they were very young, and it was obvious they were setting these children on a path that says, as one of its parameters, Bible study is not important. It just isn't. Because of the opportunities for Bible study, both for themselves as adults and for their children, they did not avail themselves of that opportunity. It said something to those children. Another parameter of that path was that assembling for worship on the first day of the week is a matter of convenience. And by convenience, I mean it's something that we're going to do if there's not something else on the weekend that we would rather do. And now these children are teenagers, and the parents are concerned. And they should be concerned. But they should have been this concerned when those children were babies. They're simply following the path that their parents have set them on. And that's all there is to it. And David had a path in mind. In the next session, we're going to talk some specifically about setting goals, spiritual goals, for yourself in regard to what you wish and want for your children to be and to become. In Joshua chapter 24, we remember that well-known statement from the great leader of God's people. He challenged the people, choose you this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods of your fathers across the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I want to tell you something. That I believe for Joshua, that was a plan, that was not a slogan. And we've turned it into a slogan. And there's nothing wrong with having that on plaques or on signs or whatever. We put them around our house as a reminder to us. But if we allow that just to be a slogan, It's not going to work. I remember several years ago hearing a politician who was talking about one of the social issues of the day. This was probably back in the 80s. And he was referring to this very well-known slogan. And he simply made the statement, slogans will not save us. But we tend to think they will somehow. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's a catchy slogan. But it better become more than a slogan. We will serve the Lord. And I want to talk about that a little bit more in our second session as well. I believe that was a plan that Joshua had for he and his house. David had a plan. We better have a plan. Number 3. David enlisted help. I want you to notice at the end of chapter 22, beginning in verse 17, David also commanded all the leaders of Israel to help his son Solomon, saying, Is not the Lord your God with you, and has He not given you rest on every side? For He has given the inhabitants of the land into my hand, and the land is subdued before the Lord and before His people. Now set your heart and your soul to seek the Lord your God. Arise, therefore, and build the sanctuary of the Lord God, so that you may bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the holy vessels of God into the house that is to be built for the name of the Lord. Do you notice who David was talking to? To all the leaders of Israel to help his son Solomon. David enlisted help. My friend Robert Prater walked in to that door right over there and said, I hope you got something to say that'll help me raising my 3 girls. And he was joking. But he wasn't joking. And no parent is joking. We'd all like to have some help, wouldn't we? We would love to have some help. And it's there if we will avail ourselves of that help. Now this is not groundbreaking stuff, okay? But let me tell you about some helps. Very important help is the Bible school program. Oh, new and innovative. No. It can be a tremendous help in the spiritual training of your children if you will allow it to be. I want to talk about a second one, but then we're going to come back and talk about these two together. Number 2, a youth minister can be a great help in the spiritual training of your children. Now the problem is, this is my observation, the problem is, I'm afraid too many parents don't see the Bible school program and the youth minister as a help. They see them as the primary means of spiritual training for their children. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, I believe that there are times, and these times happen often and in the lives of many people, when what the Lord intends to be the primary means of getting something accomplished falls through. And so somebody or something else has to step in to fill that void. Example. God intends for the primary spiritual leadership to reside with the men. I wonder where the Church of our Lord today would be were it not for the women who stepped in where their husbands failed. I'd say we'd be in a world hurt. One of my favorite stories comes from the life of Rue Porter. Rue Porter was a gospel preacher, Northwest Arkansas, and then traveled all over the United States. His mother was a Christian woman. His dad was a scoundrel. We'll just say it that way. Belle Porter, in the little town of Alpena Pass, Arkansas, a Christian woman, no church there. She saved her butter and egg money. Saved up a little bit, contacted a preacher and asked if he would come to the community and preach. She could pay him this much. And the preacher came. Souls were converted. The church was planted, still there in Alpena, Arkansas today, because of a woman who stepped in where men had failed. Now, my point is that sometimes the church has to step in where parents fail. They have to step in where parents fail. And for some people, it is the Bible school and the youth ministry that become the primary spiritual influence in children's lives. But that's not how God has it designed, and we ought not treat it that way. The primary responsibility lies with the parents. It's the parents. These are a help, and they can be a tremendous help in the spiritual training of our children. But parents, we have to stay very, very actively engaged. And our children have to understand that we understand that what's going on in the Bible school is important. And what might be going on with youth activities is important. But it's not the most important, but we as parents are concerned with that. And we're involved with it. We're engaged with it with our children because we're concerned about their being reared in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Another help that I have seen young families use very effectively has been older parents who have successfully reared their children and their children are now gone. I think of two families back home at Tahlequah. And actually this all happened before we ever moved to Tahlequah, but I've heard about it. Two young families had kids. Grandparents were not right there, and they as a family kind of adopted older couples in the congregation. And they drew upon the experience of these older couples to ask them about this process of rearing these children. And they engaged their children in the lives of these older folks. And it became a tremendous resource for them in the rearing of their children. You just think about it. In your own home congregation, are there not some older parents they've been through it and they've done it, who would be more than willing to sit down and visit with you about being a parent? Don't think that you don't need some help. We all do. And it's there if we'll just avail ourselves of that help. But most importantly, when we think about help, I want you to notice the words of David in chapter 29, verses 18 and 19. O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, preserve this forever in the intentions of the heart of your people and direct their heart to you, and give to my son Solomon a perfect heart to keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, and to do them all, and to build the temple for which I have made provision. David enlisted God's help. And parents need to do the same. Again, this is not anything innovative. Pray for your children. Enlist the help of God. I still have very vividly burned into my memory a picture of my mother. I don't remember the circumstances. I don't know why it was, but I got up much earlier one morning than I was accustomed to getting up. And I came upstairs and I passed by the living room. And out of my peripheral vision, I saw there was somebody sitting in the chair over there. And it was my mother, an open Bible on her lap, and her head bowed in prayer. I didn't know she did that. She prayed for her children. Fervently prayed for her children. And I am convinced, can't prove it, but I am convinced, as I look back over my life, particularly during teenage years, and some things that transpired that could have turned out quite differently. But they didn't. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous woman avails much. And I'm grateful my mother prayed for me. Tanya and I prayed for our children. And we pray for the parents of children that we don't know. We have come to know. We didn't know for a long time that we were praying for Dennis and Dina Lovett. That's our daughter's in-laws. The parents of the boy that won our daughter's heart. Still a little sore about that, but that's another subject. An exceptional Christian young man. And we believe that God has heard our prayers, that we prayed for a long time. For the parents that were raising the boy that would become our daughter's husband. Enlist the Lord's help.